It's a 200-year-old book falling apart at the spine, Josie. I'm not being sentimental about it, I'm being responsible. Somebody has to protect it before it's too fragile to read at all. My cousin said that standing in Grandma Vera's front room, both hands resting possessively on top of the Calloway family Bible like she was already deciding who got to touch it and who didn't. I'd grown up watching that book get pulled down off its shelf every Christmas and every funeral, every wedding and every christening. My grandmother reading out the names in the front pages the same unhurried way every single time, like she was introducing us to people who couldn't be in the room anymore but still deserved to be spoken about like they were. I asked to see it before she took it anywhere. She hesitated a half-second too long, the particular hesitation of someone doing math in their head about how much they actually needed to let me look at it right then. Then she smiled, told me she'd get it back to everybody good as new, and carried it out to her car in a padded case I'd never seen before, like she'd been planning exactly this errand for a while. I didn't stop her that afternoon. I've spent my entire career learning that the worst thing you can do to a fragile document is handle it in a panic, so I did the thing I actually know how to do instead. I went quiet, and I started paying attention. 6 weeks later, at the trust distribution meeting held right there in Grandma Vera's front room, with a bank trust officer at the head of the table and every branch of this family gathered to finally divide up what a natural gas company had offered for the mineral rights under land my family had held since 1874. My cousin would stand up and present that same restored Bible as proof that an entire branch of our own family didn't legally exist anymore, and I would stand up right after her, holding photographs I'd taken of those exact pages 9 years earlier, before anyone thought there was a reason to fake them. My name is Josephine Calloway. Everybody calls me Josie. I'm 31 years old, and I'm a professional genealogist. I spend my working life finding the people other families have lost track of, proving who actually belongs to who using nothing but paper, patience, and records nobody else thought to check twice. If you've ever watched someone try to rewrite who counts as family the moment real money got involved, stay with me to the end, because my grandmother's own great-grandmother started a habit 150 years ago that turned out to be the single hardest thing in this whole story to erase. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. And if you're the kind of person who stays until a story's finished, subscribe now, because it took me 6 weeks to prove what should have taken 6 minutes, and it's going to take me the next hour to show you exactly why that mattered to you understand what happened at that trust distribution meeting. You need to understand 160 acres of Kentucky bluegrass hill country that's belonged to my family since 1874. A leather-bound Bible that's outlived 6 generations of the people who wrote in it, and a piece of trust language written 70 years ago that nobody in this family understood the real weight of until a gas company showed up with a number attached to it. Calloway Hollow sits about 50 minutes outside Lexington, the kind of place where the county road turns to gravel a mile before it reaches the house, and everybody who lives out that way still waves at every truck that passes, recognized or not. My great-great-grandmother, Emmeline Calloway, homesteaded that land in 1874, widowed young, raising 4 children alone on a hillside most people at the time considered too steep to farm properly. She was, by every account passed down to me, not a woman who explained herself twice. She was also, and this matters enormously to everything that came after, the first Calloway to start writing family entries into the front pages of a Bible her own mother had carried from Virginia. Every birth, every marriage, every death, recorded in careful, deliberate handwriting, a habit she started not out of sentiment but because in 1870s rural Kentucky, a state birth or marriage certificate for a family living that far up a hollow was, more often than not, simply a piece of paper nobody had ever gotten around to filing. That habit held for 150 years. Every Calloway who has been born, married, or buried since 1874 has an entry in that Bible, in the handwriting of whichever family matriarch was keeping it at the time. My grandmother, Vera Calloway, is 89 years old and has been the keeper of that book since her own mother passed in 1987, which means for the better part of 4 decades, Vera has been the one steady hand behind that particular tradition. Vera's father, Silas Calloway, was Emmeline's grandson, and he expanded the original homestead considerably through the early 20th century, buying up 2 adjoining parcels during the Depression when neighboring families were desperate to sell. By the time Silas died in 1971, Calloway Hollow had grown to 160 acres, most of it timber and pasture, with mineral rights nobody in the family had ever seriously thought about because nobody drilling for anything had ever bothered to ask. In 1958, 13 years before he died, Silas worked with a young Lexington attorney to set up a family trust governing exactly how that land, and anything it ever produced, would eventually be divided among his descendants. The attorney's name was Judith Marlowe's predecessor at the same small firm, a detail that matters later, because Judith herself would eventually inherit both the firm and, without fully realizing it at the time, the strange, deliberate choice her predecessor and my great-grandfather made together that year. The trust's language was unusual, and it was unusual on purpose. Rather than naming specific heirs, or relying on a formal legal genealogy, the trust stated that the Callaway Hollow property and its proceeds would pass, in equal shares, to all lineal descendants of Emmeline Callaway, as recorded in the Callaway family Bible. Silas chose that language deliberately, according to a letter Judith would later dig out of her firm's archived files, because he'd watched, in his own lifetime, at least 2 families in the county tear themselves apart in court trying to prove who was and wasn't a legitimate descendant using incomplete county records from an era when rural Kentucky simply hadn't kept especially thorough ones. He trusted the Bible. He trusted it because he'd watched 3 generations of Callaway women keep it faithfully, without exception, without omission, regardless of which branch of the family a particular birth or marriage happened to belong to. For 66 years, that trust language sat quietly in a filing cabinet, more or less irrelevant, because the land produced modest income from timber and cattle leasing and nobody's inheritance depended on litigating the fine print of who counted as a descendant. Everybody already knew who everybody was. The Bible simply confirmed it, the way it always had. That changed in the spring of this year, when a company called Bluegrass Energy Partners approached my grandmother about leasing the natural gas rights beneath Callaway Hollow, following a series of successful test wells on adjoining properties 2 hollows over. Their offer, once finalized, came to $3,150,000 for a 20-year mineral lease, an amount of money that, divided among the 11 documented descendants the family had always assumed existed, worked out to a little over $286,000 per share. Divided among 7, if a particular branch of the family were somehow excluded, that number climbs past $450,000 a share. I was born in 1994, the older of Owen Callaway's 2 children. My father, Owen, is Vera's son, a quiet, steady man who's worked the same tobacco and cattle operation on the family's home parcel his entire life and has never once, in my recollection, wanted anything from that trust beyond what was fairly his. My mother passed when I was young, and I spent most of my childhood summers at Vera's kitchen table more than my own, learning to read her handwriting in that Bible before I understood what half the entries actually meant. My aunt, Patricia Callaway Sutter, Vera's daughter, my father's younger sister, married into a family with considerably more ambition about money than mine ever showed, and her daughter, my cousin Deanna, grew up believing, in a way I understood without anyone ever needing to explain it to me, that the Callaway name was worth considerably more than the modest, steady life the rest of us seemed content to live inside of. I want to be clear, I never disliked my cousin growing up. We spent plenty of summers together on that same porch, same as any 2 cousins close in age. This isn't her villain origin story, not entirely. But you need to understand the shape of her ambition, and the shape of the debt underneath it, before I show you what she tried to do with a 200-year-old book that had never once, in 6 generations, been used against anyone. I studied history and archival science, and after an internship with a probate genealogy firm during graduate school, the kind of work that involves tracking down missing heirs to unclaimed estates using nothing but census records, church registries, and a great deal of patience, I discovered I had both a talent and a genuine love for exactly the kind of documentary detective work most people find unbearably tedious. I've spent the last 6 years as an independent contractor for Wexford Air Search Associates, a firm that does exactly that work professionally, on behalf of probate attorneys and estate trustees who need to locate legally documented descendants of people who died without clear wills. I make a modest but comfortable living doing, essentially, for strangers, the exact thing my own great-great-grandmother had already done for my family 150 years before I was born, one careful handwritten entry at a time. What none of us understood, walking into that spring, was how directly those 2 things, My profession and my family's own quiet, sacred paper trail were about to collide. The Bluegrass Energy offer landed at the end of March, delivered first to Vera as the trust's sole surviving original trustee, and then, over the following weeks, to the rest of the family through a series of increasingly excited phone calls that mostly ran through Aunt Patricia and, from there, to Deanna. I want to say the family processed this together, carefully, the way a document this significant deserved to be handled. We didn't. What actually happened is that a family group text, which had previously existed mostly to coordinate who was bringing what to Thanksgiving, exploded within about 72 hours into a running conversation about boat payments, kitchen renovations, and, in Deanna's case specifically, a boutique event venue she'd been trying to get off the ground for 2 years on a property outside Lexington that needed, by her own repeated estimate, somewhere around $140,000 in capital she did not currently have. Deanna volunteered, early and enthusiastically, to help coordinate everything on the family's end, an offer that on its face looked exactly like the kind of generous, organized help a big, spread-out family often genuinely needs when something this significant lands in their lap all at once. She set up a shared spreadsheet. She scheduled a call with Judith Marlowe's office to review the trust's original language. She was, by every outward measure, doing precisely what a helpful, capable relative does in a moment like this. It was during that call with Judith, which I only heard about secondhand at first, that the Bible's role in all of this became clear to the wider family for the first time. Judith explained the 1958 trust language plainly, descendants as recorded in the Callaway family Bible, and noted, almost as an aside, that the trust had never required a formal legal genealogy because the Bible had always been treated as sufficient documentation on its own. Deanna, according to my father, who was on that call, asked several careful, specific follow-up questions about exactly what as recorded meant, and what would happen if a particular entry in the Bible were unclear, incomplete, or missing. I didn't think much of that detail when my father mentioned it to me afterward. Genealogists get asked exactly that kind of question constantly, and it's not, on its own, a red flag. Incomplete or ambiguous records are simply a fact of working with century-old handwritten documents, and asking about the process for handling them is entirely reasonable. What made me start paying closer attention happened about 2 weeks later, in mid-April, when Deanna called Vera directly and suggested, with what I'm told was considerable warmth and concern, that the family Bible was in rough shape and really ought to be professionally restored before it gets handled by a room full of lawyers and bankers, given how significant this particular meeting was going to be. Vera's eyesight has been declining for the better part of 3 years now. Macular degeneration, well documented, well managed, but real. She can still read large print with a magnifier, still recognizes every face at her own table, still runs her household finances with the same sharp attention she always has. What she can no longer do easily, without real strain, is closely examine small, faded, century-old handwriting the way she once could without a second thought. Deanna knew that. Everybody in this family knew that. And I think, looking back, that's exactly the vulnerability she was counting on. Not confusion, not incapacity, just a grandmother who could no longer verify, with her own eyes, whether the book that came back from restoration was actually the same book that left. She said she'd found somebody wonderful, Vera told me, when I called her that same week to ask about it. Said it was the kind of thing that needed doing before it fell apart in somebody's hands at the meeting. I told her that seemed sensible. I didn't think there was any harm in it, Josie. I asked who the restorer was. Vera didn't know. I asked whether it was someone Judith's office had recommended, or someone from the Regional Historical Society. I could have pointed her toward myself, given that this is, quite literally, the exact kind of professional referral I make for clients regularly. Vera didn't know that either. I called Deanna directly that same afternoon. I found a guy, she told me, breezy, almost bored, the tone I'd come to recognize over the years as her particular way of closing a subject before anyone had a chance to ask a second question about it. He does book conservation, does a bunch of historical societies around the state. It's handled, Josie. You don't need to worry about it. I'd really like his name and credentials, I said. This is genuinely what I do professionally. I have people I trust for exactly this kind of work. It's already dropped off, she said. I'll get it back to everybody good as new before the meeting. I sat with that call for a long time afterward, turning over the specific, deliberate way she'd closed the conversation before I could get a single useful detail out of her. I told myself, the way I've apparently been telling myself things about my cousin's ambitions for most of my adult life, that it probably meant less than it felt like it meant. If you've ever had a small, oddly evasive phone call sit wrong with you for reasons you couldn't quite name yet, tell me in the comments, because that was the exact moment I stopped assuming this was nothing. The first thing I actually noticed, and genuinely couldn't explain away, happened about 10 days later, when I drove out to Vera's for our usual Sunday visit and found Aunt Patricia there instead of Deanna, sorting through a stack of what looked like old family photographs at the kitchen table. Deanna's still got the Bible, Patricia told me, a little too quickly, before I'd even asked. The restoration's taking longer than she thought. These old books, you know how it is. I asked how much longer. Patricia said she wasn't entirely sure, something about the binding needing extra time to cure properly, and asked if I wanted coffee. In the last week of April, I called Judith Marlowe's office directly, mostly out of professional habit more than active suspicion, and asked whether her office had ever seen documentation of the original Bible entries. Photographs, a formal appraisal, anything establishing a clear record of what the book actually contained before it went out for restoration. Judith, to her credit, was honest with me immediately. I haven't laid eyes on that Bible in probably 15 years, she admitted. It's always just been understood as the family's record. I never had a reason to independently document its contents, because nobody's inheritance had ever actually depended on a disputed entry before now. That admission sat with me for days. A trust that had gone 66 years without anyone needing to formally verify its most important piece of documentary evidence was, I understood with a growing unease, a trust that had never actually been tested, which meant nobody currently living, aside from Vera herself, and her memory of what she'd read aloud from that book at every holiday for 4 decades, could say with total certainty what it actually contained. The gap that finally cracked this open for me came in the first week of May, at a family cookout at my father's place, when Deanna mentioned, almost in passing, while helping herself to a plate, that the Ferricide's records are honestly pretty spotty anyway, so it might not even matter how the restoration comes out for them. I want to be honest about something. I didn't immediately understand the full weight of that sentence. I asked her what she meant. Great Aunt Mabel's line, she said, like it was common knowledge. You know how that whole branch just kind of drifted off. Honestly, I don't think anybody's even sure the records were ever that solid to begin with. I have spent my entire adult life reading exactly this kind of casual, confident sentence from clients and opposing family members in probate disputes. The kind of sentence designed to plant a seed of doubt about a document's reliability well before anyone's actually had the chance to examine it closely. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, because I knew, with total professional certainty, that I had personally seen Mabel Calloway Ferris's birth entry in that Bible with my own eyes, more than once, as a child sitting at Vera's kitchen table while she read the names aloud. Mabel was Vera's younger sister, my grandmother's own sister, who eloped in 1962 with a traveling musician the family considered entirely unsuitable, moved to Ohio, and drifted out of regular contact over the following decades in the specific, sad, unremarkable way families sometimes simply do, without any dramatic final rupture, just years of birthdays and holidays quietly slipping past without a call. Mabel passed away nearly 20 years ago. Her children, Vera's nieces and nephews, my own second cousins once removed, are, as far as I knew, still living, still scattered, still, as far as this family's trust was concerned, entirely legitimate lineal descendants of Emmeline Calloway, entitled to exactly the same share as the rest of us. Unless, I understood, standing at that cookout with a paper plate going cold in my hand, somebody had decided that record was inconvenient. If you've ever had a family member confidently describe a fact you personally knew to be false, and realized in that exact moment they weren't simply mistaken, they were testing the room, tell me in the comments, because that cookout was the moment I stopped being polite about any of it. I drove to Judith Marlowe's office the following Monday, without an appointment, and asked her the question I should have asked weeks earlier. If the Bible comes back from restoration missing an entry, or with an entry that's been altered, how would anyone at that distribution meeting actually know? Judith set down her pen and looked at me for a long moment. Honestly, Josie, they wouldn't. Not unless somebody had an independent record to compare it against. I've represented this trust for 11 years, since I took over the firm, and I've never once had reason to think the Bible itself needed independent verification. It's always simply been trusted, the same way it's been trusted for 66 years before that. What happens if a documented branch gets excluded from the distribution because their entry can't be found? Then, absent some other proof of descent, the trust language technically permits the remaining documented descendants to divide the full amount among themselves, she said slowly, clearly working through the implication in real time as she said it. I want to be very clear that I have no reason, right now, to think that's what's actually happening here. But I also want to be honest with you that if it were happening, the trust's own language, as written, wouldn't necessarily catch it on its own. It would need somebody to catch it. I told her about the cookout, about Deanna's comment regarding the spotty Ferris records, about the unnamed restorer, about the 6 weeks that had now stretched on with no photographs, no invoice, no credentials, nothing but Deanna's repeated assurance that it was handled. Judith was quiet for a moment. I want to say something to you honestly, because I think you're about to need to trust your own judgment more than anyone else's in this, she said. I have sat across the table from families litigating exactly this kind of dispute for 11 years. The families who win those disputes almost never win them because a judge simply decided to believe the more sympathetic version of events. They win because somebody, usually exactly one somebody, went and found the independent proof before the hearing instead of during it. If you think there's any chance that book is coming back altered, the time to build your own record is now, quietly, before the meeting, not after. I asked her what independent proof would even look like, for a document this old and this specific. Church records, if the family had a home congregation, she said. Census records, which are federal, permanent, and can't be altered by anyone in this family no matter how badly they might want to. Any prior legal proceeding that might have required a family genealogy to be documented. An old probate, an old land dispute, anything that would have required someone, at some point, to formally list Silas Calloway's descendants under oath. She paused. And, Josie, this is the part one actually think matters most. Do you have any photographs of that Bible yourself? Anything at all, even something old and unofficial? I sat very still in that chair for a long moment, because I did 9 years ago, the summer before I started graduate school, long before any gas company had ever heard of Calloway Hollow, long before any inheritance depended on a single page of that book, I had spent an entire rainy Saturday afternoon at Vera's kitchen table, photographing every single page of the family Bible's genealogical section for my own personal archive. A habit, frankly, that most professional genealogists develop early, because we've all seen what happens to family documents that nobody thought to independently preserve before a fire, a flood, or, as it turned out, a cousin with a motive. I drove home from Judith's office that same afternoon and spent 4 hours going through an external hard drive I hadn't opened in years, and there they were, 41 high-resolution photographs, time-stamped, of every genealogical entry in the Calloway family Bible as it existed 9 years earlier, including, on the 4th page of the marriages section, in Vera's mother's careful, looping handwriting. Mabel Louise Calloway to Arlo Ferris. Wed June 14, 1962, Bourbon County Courthouse. And 2 pages later, in the birth section, in that same handwriting, entries for Mabel's 3 children, born 1963, 1965, and 1968, each one recorded with the same unhurried care as every other entry in that book. I sat at my kitchen table staring at those photographs for a long time, feeling something settle into place that I hadn't fully let myself believe until that exact moment. This wasn't a question of spotty records. This was a fully, unambiguously documented branch of this family, recorded in this family's own hand, 62 years ago, by a woman who had absolutely no reason to lie about it and every reason to record it faithfully, the same way she'd recorded every other entry in that book. I called Judith that same evening and told her what I had. That's a genuinely significant find, she said. But I want us to build this properly, not just react to it. A set of old photographs is strong, but I want it to be part of something considerably larger, so that nobody can argue it away as one relative's word against another's. Give me a couple of weeks. I know the meeting's coming up fast. I promise you it's enough time, once you see what we can actually put together. What followed was the strangest, most disciplined 2 weeks of my professional life, made stranger by the fact that I was, for the first time in my career, building a case for my own family instead of a stranger's. I started with church records. The Calloway family had attended New Hope Baptist Church, a small congregation about 4 miles from the homestead, for over a century, and the church's longtime record keeper, a sharp, precise woman named Idella Prater who'd been maintaining that congregation's archives for close to 40 years, met me the following week with the church's original baptismal ledgers going back to the 1880s. Within 20 minutes, she'd located it, Mabel Louise Calloway's baptism, recorded in 1943, and, further along in a separate ledger, the baptisms of all 3 of Mabel's children, performed at New Hope during visits back to Kentucky in the mid-1960s, before the family's contact with that branch fully faded. I remember Mabel, Idella told me, closing the ledger carefully. Not well, I was a girl myself when she left, but I remember my own mother mentioning it, the scandal of it at the time. Families around here didn't talk about elopements kindly back then. But scandal or not, a baptism's a baptism. The church doesn't baptize somebody because a family stopped speaking to them. Next, I pulled federal census records, public, permanent, and entirely beyond anyone in my family's ability to alter. The 1950 census showed Mabel Calloway, age 7, in Silas Calloway's household on Callaway Hollow Road. The 1970 census showed Mabel Ferris, age 27, in a household in Franklin County, Ohio, with a husband named Arlo and 3 children listed by name and age, matching, almost exactly, the entries in the family Bible I'd photographed 9 years earlier. Then came the piece Judith had specifically flagged as potentially decisive, a prior legal proceeding requiring a formal genealogy. It took a full week of digging through county probate records, working with a records clerk named Wanda Pilkington at the Bourbon County Courthouse, before I found it. A 1975 probate filing, from the settlement of Silas Calloway's own estate 4 years after his death, in which the estate's attorney at the time had been required, under Kentucky probate law, to list every one of Silas's legal grandchildren by name for a partial preliminary distribution of certain non-trust assets. That filing, notarized, and formally entered into the county's public record 50 years ago, listed Mabel's 3 children by name, alongside every other Calloway grandchild living at the time. A document created a decade before anyone alive today had any reason to fabricate or dispute it, sitting in a county courthouse basement the entire time, utterly indifferent to whatever a gas company might eventually offer for the mineral rights above it. This is the piece I was hoping we'd find, Judith told me, when I brought her the certified copy. A notarized 1975 court filing, made under oath, listing the exact same descendants your photographs show recorded in the Bible 13 years earlier, corroborated independently by church and federal records. Josie, I want to be plain with you. This isn't a close call anymore. This is about as complete a documentary record as I've ever seen assembled for a family dispute this size. There was still one piece missing, and it was the piece that would ultimately matter most in that room. Proof, not just that the original entries existed, but that the Bible Deanna intended to present at the meeting had actually been altered. Judith brought in a forensic document examiner named Naomi Strand, a meticulous, soft-spoken woman who'd spent close to 20 years analyzing questioned documents for estate and probate disputes across the region. Precisely the kind of expert whose entire career depends on being able to tell, with scientific certainty, whether a 150-year-old page is exactly what it claims to be. The Bible finally came back from restoration 9 days before the scheduled distribution meeting, delivered to Vera by Deanna herself with what my father described as considerable ceremony. A new protective case, a laminated card describing the conservation work performed, and an invoice for $2,400 from a business calling itself Heritage Bindery Restoration, an outfit none of us, including Idella Prater, who knew every legitimate book conservator working in 3 counties, had ever heard of. Naomi examined the returned Bible over 2 full days, comparing it page by page against my 9-year-old photographs, and what she found, laid out in a careful, methodical written report, confirmed everything I'd begun to suspect and considerably more. The overwhelming majority of this book is exactly what it claims to be, she told Judith and me, spreading photographs of individual pages across a conference table. Original binding, original paper, ink consistent with the mid to late 1800s and various points across the 20th century, exactly matching what you'd expect from a document maintained continuously across 6 generations. But 4 pages, specifically the 2 pages in the marriages section and the 2 pages in the birth section covering the years 1962 through 1968, are not original at all. They're modern paper, artificially aged through a chemical toning process, printed with a reproduction technique designed to mimic handwriting rather than actual ink applied by hand. And the handwriting itself, while a competent forgery, doesn't match the pen pressure or letterform habits present anywhere else in the book. She pulled up a side-by-side comparison on her laptop screen. This is your photograph from 9 years ago, showing Mabel Ferris's marriage entry in what I'd describe as your great-grandmother's authentic hand. This is the corresponding page from the book that came back from restoration 3 weeks ago. The entry for Mabel's marriage is simply gone. In its place is a slightly rewritten transition between the surrounding original entries, constructed carefully enough that, without your photographs to compare it against, most people would never notice a page had been altered at all. I sat with that finding for a long moment, feeling the full, deliberate shape of what had actually happened settle into place. This hadn't been careless. This had been planned with real precision, 4 specific pages, chosen exactly to remove one branch of this family from a document nobody but Vera had closely examined in years, replaced with a version convincing enough to survive a room full of relatives who trusted the book without ever thinking to question it. Naomi also traced Heritage Bindery Restoration, the business listed on the invoice, and found it wasn't a registered book conservation business at all. It was, according to state business filings, a sole proprietorship registered 8 months earlier under the name of a man named Milo Trask, whose actual trade, according to his own public social media, was custom leatherwork and printing, not archival conservation of any kind. When Naomi's investigator reached out to him directly, he agreed, somewhat nervously, to a recorded conversation, admitting that a woman named Deanna had paid him $2,400 in cash to reproduce a few pages that looked old, make them match the rest of the book, nothing illegal about aging paper, and that he'd been told, specifically, which 4 pages needed to be replaced and roughly what the new entries should say. I didn't ask a lot of questions, he admitted. She said it was a family thing, said the pages were damaged beyond saving anyway, and this way at least something legible would be there. I didn't think about it past that, honestly, until your investigator called. He agreed to give a written statement. I've built cases on thinner evidence than this, Judith told me, closing the file 2 nights before the meeting. Your photographs establish what the original entries said. The church records and the 1975 probate filing corroborate them independently, from sources entirely outside this family's control. Naomi's forensic analysis proves the returned Bible was altered, and Milo Trask's statement proves who paid for it and why. Your grandmother built the first 60 years of this record without ever imagining she'd need to protect it from her own family. You just spent the last 2 weeks finishing what she started. I want to pause here, because I don't think this story is honest if I let you believe my cousin acted entirely alone, or that everyone around her simply looked the other way without a second thought. Deanna's son, Tanner, 27, had been the one who'd physically driven the Bible to Milo Trask's shop back in April, at his mother's request, and had picked it up again 3 weeks later. I drove out to see him 2 days before the meeting, before Judith had said anything to anyone else, mostly because I wanted to see his face when I asked him one simple question. He looked genuinely uneasy the moment I brought it up, turning his truck keys over in his hands on his own front porch. Mom said it was just standard preservation stuff, he told me. Said the guy specialized in old books, worked with historical societies. I dropped it off, picked it up 3 weeks later, didn't think much else about it. He paused. She did tell me not to mention it to you specifically. Said you'd probably want to get involved and slow everything down with process. Her word, not mine. I told him what Naomi had found, what Milo Trask had admitted, what 4 pages had actually been removed and why. I watched my cousin's own son go very still on that porch, absorbing the fact that he'd personally carried the evidence of a decades-old family document straight into the hands of a man paid to erase part of it. "I drove it there myself," he said quietly. "I didn't ask why it needed to be somebody Mom found on her own instead of somebody you'd have recommended, when you're literally the person in this family who does this professionally. That should have been the first thing that seemed strange to me, and it wasn't, because it was just Mom asking me to run an errand, same as always." 2 days later, on his own, without my asking him to, Tanner called Judith's office and gave a voluntary statement confirming the timeline of the drop-off and pick-up exactly as he remembered it. It didn't undo what had already been done to those 4 pages. But it was, I think, the first fully honest thing anyone close to my cousin had done in this entire arrangement, and I've never once regretted telling him the truth before the meeting instead of letting him find out with everyone else in that front room. There was one more thing I needed to do before that meeting, and it mattered more to me than any of the forensic reports combined. Working from the 1970 census record and the 1975 probate filing, I traced Mabel's surviving daughter, Faye Ferris Whitlock, now 76 years old, still living in the same corner of Franklin County, Ohio, where her mother had raised her. I called her on a Tuesday evening, nervous in a way I hadn't been through any of the document research, because this was the one part of this story that wasn't really about paper at all. "I wondered if anybody down there even remembered we existed," she told me, after I'd explained who I was and why I was calling. "Mama used to talk about that house sometimes, near the end. Said she always figured the door was closed for good. I never held it against your grandmother, for what it's worth. Families do what families do, and by the time anybody might have wanted to fix it, too many years had already gone by to know how." I told her about the trust, about the gas lease, about what her share, and her siblings' shares, would actually mean under the trust as it was originally, honestly recorded. I told her, too, about what had almost happened instead. She was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. "I don't need anybody's charity, and I don't need a stranger's pity either," she said finally. "But I'll tell you honestly, it means something different, hearing that Mama's own handwriting, her mother's handwriting, I mean, is still sitting in a photograph somewhere, proving she never stopped being who she was to that family, whatever anybody decided to do about it afterward." I asked her if she'd be willing to come to the meeting. She was quiet again, longer this time. "I believe I would," she said. "I think Mama would have liked knowing somebody finally went and checked instead of just letting the silence decide it for her." The meeting was held exactly where it always would have been held, in Vera's front room, the same room that Bible had sat in for 4 decades, with Preston Mills, the trust officer from First Bluegrass Trust and Savings, seated at the head of the table with a folder of distribution paperwork already drafted, and Judith Marlowe seated quietly near the window with a folder of her own. Deanna arrived with the Bible in its new protective case, set it down at the center of the table with visible pride, and opened with a short, warm speech about how much work had gone into finally getting this properly preserved for the whole family. Thanking, with a warmth I will remember for a long time, Grandma Vera for trusting me to take care of something this important to all of us. Preston Mills asked, as a matter of routine, whether all documented descendants of Emmeline Calloway, per the Trust's language, were accounted for in the distribution figures Deanna's spreadsheet had prepared. Deanna answered smoothly that the Ferris branch's records had turned out to be incomplete upon closer inspection during the restoration process, and that, regretfully, the Trust's own language meant that branch simply couldn't be included in a formal legal distribution without documentation that, as far as she understood, no longer existed. I stood up before Preston could move on to the next line item. "I'd like the record to reflect something different," I said, and laid my folder open on the table. The 9-year-old photographs first, the marriage and birth entries clearly legible in Vera's own mother's handwriting, dated and time-stamped on my own device long before this trust had ever been worth fighting over. Judith stood next, and entered Naomi Strand's forensic report, the church baptismal records from New Hope Baptist, the certified copy of the 1975 probate filing, and Milo Trask's signed statement describing exactly which pages he'd been paid to alter and by whom. The room, warm and celebratory only a moment earlier, went very quiet, in the particular way I'd learned, over 6 years of this exact profession, means everyone present has just understood, all at once, which version of events is actually true. I watched my cousin's face do something I had genuinely never seen it do in 31 years of knowing her. It simply stopped performing. All at once, with nowhere left to arrange itself, it just stopped. Preston Mills asked, evenly, whether anyone present could explain the discrepancy between the original photographed entries and the version currently sitting on the table in front of him. Deanna didn't answer. Her attorney, seated beside her, asked for a brief recess, and Preston granted it without much enthusiasm. It was during that recess that the front door opened, and Faye Ferris Whitlock walked in, 76 years old, a little uncertain on the front step, looking around a room she hadn't stood in since she was a small child riding in the back of her mother's car the last time anyone remembered her visiting at all. Vera stood up from her chair slowly, crossed the room without a word, and took both of Faye's hands in her own. "I should have called you 50 years ago," Vera said, her voice unsteady in a way I'd rarely heard from her. "I let too much silence do the deciding for me. I'm glad my granddaughter didn't make the same mistake." There was no dramatic confrontation after that. Deanna's attorney returned from the recess and quietly requested that the distribution proceed according to the documented record rather than the altered one, an outcome Preston Mills confirmed he had, in any case, no legal authority to decide otherwise about, given the evidence now sitting in front of him. The trust distribution was finalized 4 weeks later, with all 11 documented descendants of Emmeline Calloway, including Faye and her 2 surviving siblings, receiving their full, equal share of the Bluegrass Energy lease payment. Judith referred the forgery of the family Bible's pages, along with Milo Trask's statement, to the county prosecutor's office for review. As of this recording, that review is ongoing, and Deanna has retained her own separate attorney to respond to it. My Aunt Patricia has not been implicated in the forgery itself, though I think she'll be sitting with her own quiet complicity, the choice to simply repeat what her daughter told her rather than ask a single hard question, for a long while yet. Tanner doesn't work with his mother's event venture anymore. He called me a few weeks ago, mostly just to talk, and mentioned, almost offhand, that he'd started looking into his own side of the family's records, just to actually understand where I come from instead of assuming I already knew. I told him that's more or less how this entire profession starts for most of us. Faye and I talk most weeks now. She sent me a photograph a month ago, her mother, Mabel, as a young woman, standing in front of the same house Vera still lives in, taken sometime in the late 1950s, years before any of what came after. I had it printed and framed, and I gave it to Vera on her 90th birthday. She keeps it on the mantel now, beside the restored Bible, which sits, once again, exactly as it should. Its 4 false pages formally removed and replaced with careful, honest reproductions of the originals, made this time by Idella Prater herself, working directly from my 9-year-old photographs. In ink and handwriting she took considerable care to make clear was a modern restoration rather than any attempt to pass itself off as the real thing. I still photograph every genealogical document I work with professionally, the same habit I picked up entirely by accident 9 years ago, sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table on a rainy Saturday with no idea I was building the single most important piece of evidence I would ever assemble. I think about that afternoon often now, how ordinary it felt at the time, how little I understood that the quiet, careful habit of simply writing things down and keeping a record, the exact thing my great-great-grandmother started 150 years ago for reasons that had nothing to do with anyone's gas lease, would turn out to be the one thing in this entire family that money could never quite manage to erase. If you've ever been the one person in your family who actually went and checked the record instead of just believing whoever told the story loudest, tell me in the comments what that cost you, and whether it was worth it. I read every single one. And if this story found you at the right moment tonight, share it with the person in your life who's still doing the checking, they'll know exactly why.